So this is a paper Jim did a couple years ago with Carolina Mintavera. Um, it was it's kind of similar in some ways to Christine's study, where we're trying to tease out um, you know kind of attribute the variation in size at age data, and whether that's due to year effects, age effects, cohort effects, those kind of things. There's a few differences though, but anyway, it was kind of written with the assessment purpose in mind. In a select assessments, we have to convert numbers in the assessment to weights. Our quotas are in terms of weights usually. So we have to have some kind of length at age and weighted age function to do that. So some people do that within the assessment, and there's different ways of doing that in the assessment. So this is this uses the random effects approach, and Jim was kind of thinking how practical would that be to do in an assessment. You might have variation in a lot of different things that can be modeled with random effects, but within an assessment you might have to.
Can you make
Oh yeah. Let's see here. Some of this is kind of driven by practicality. I mean, what can you do in assessment when you're trying to estimate all these other parameters too? And there might, another question too is kind of the relative magnitude of this variation. If you had to choose kind of one of these factors, which one might explain the most variation. Another thing sometimes people do in assessments is, they might have kind of empirical weights at age that they might smooth in some way. And some of this could be used as a model for kind of smoothing that data. And if you choose a model, which is the best model to smooth that data before it goes into assessment. So those are some of the considerations. I won't, I'll kind of focus mostly on the modeling side of things and not so much on the assessment side of things. But kind of see what we can do in our group. But this is another difference from Christine's study, is that this actually uses the von Berlanti growth function. So as we've all seen, here it is in terms of length, and then. Jim was working with weighted age data, so he had weighted age data, but not length at age data. So he had to, so there's this alpha parameter here that is kind of a condition factor. I never really thought of it that way, but it's absolutely right. I think, it converts weight to length. So a fish of a given size could be any weight, depending on how fat it is. So that's one of the key parameters we were looking at. Jim was looking at. And the other one is the growth coefficient, the K parameter. And so L infinity is, you can kind of see alpha and L infinity are sort of confounded with each other. They multiply by each other, so it's hard to separate the two from each other. And another thing with this data set is that they didn't have very many fish that were at the flat part of the von Berlanti curve. So you can imagine, if you had like a rockfish, typically you have, when you get to that flat part of the curve, you have a rockfish that's about this, the same size over many different ages. They just kind of stay the same length over, once they get to pupa mature. So that kind of gives you good contrast on data to estimate length and infinity. But in their case, they had like 91 data sets. A lot of their stocks were pretty young. They kind of had the linear part of the curve, at the lower ages, but not so much at L infinity, so they couldn't really estimate that very well. So Christine did a really good job of explaining, the cohort effects, year effects, and age effects. So some very nice graphics that I don't have here, but it's the same idea. So here's kind of a modified K parameter for the von Berlanti curve, and these are just kind of log normal errors, and with these kind of things. So this kind of just plugs in to, this whole thing plugs into the K parameter. And when you do that, you get a kind of a more complicated kind of weight-based von Berlanti curve. And they also did it for alpha too. So that's that's kind of shown here as well. So these things are all kind of modeled as random effects. And they did kind of several permutations where they looked at modeling all three at once, modeling one at a time, there's also kind of two different types of things they're modeling here, these two parameters, and whether, so there's different kind of permutations that I get into on how they do this. But, in terms of the estimation, like I said, that, they're fitting to weighted age data, they're assumed to be normal residual errors, and looking at variation over time and K and alpha, models that are random effects, and looking at it from 3 different ways, variation in terms of in terms of age, cohorts, and years. Look at, using JEGs, just another Gibbs sampler in R as a software tool. So I guess, this data set, I think Carolina had worked with it before, but it was for, it might have been for a dissertation. So they had this data set kind of ready to go. And actually, we might want to contact Carolina. I mean, some of this data might be good for our purposes as well. So anyway, 5 orders of fish, 25 species, 91 different stocks. Let's see here. So there's kind of a 3x3 factorial here. So there's 3 treatments. Whether you put this time varying variability. Whether it's absent, whether it's in the K parameter or whether it's in the alpha parameter, and then you kind of make this choice for each of the age effects, year effects, and core effects. So there's a total of 27 different potential models, and there was different evaluation criteria depending on what your goals were. If you wanted the most parsimonious model, the model that fit the data the best with the most efficient use of parameters, you might look at the DIC. That'd be kind of one criteria. Perhaps you want to look at just putting the effects into just looking at just the age effects or just the year effects or just the core effects. If you could identify maybe one of these things to look at, which would be the best one to look at. And this, the reason for doing this is because it might be hard to do all 3 of these things at the same time in an assessment model. And then another thing, they looked at too is which of these models explains the most variance. So not so much looking at parsimony, but just what model explains is most descriptive of data, and that might be something to think about if you're trying to smooth the data outside of an assessment. So they had some results that were a little bit similar to what Christine showed in terms of partitioning the variance among these different factors. What they found was that the year effect was really dominant. I mean, within a given year, you might see, an effect that extended across all different ages and cohorts, and that was much more common than, say, an age effect or a cohort effect. And that also had, kind of the biggest magnitude of the variation, the biggest standard errors, too. These models explained about 60% of the variance, and then the year and cohort effects explain much more of the variance in the age effects, which I think kind of, if you think about it, kind of makes sense. There might be like a shock to a system in a given year that would extend across all ages, as opposed to at every time a fish turns a certain age, something happens, which seems a bit less kind of related to the environment. Kind of thinking about this in terms of our group, and this is from discussion from Jim's paper, but and this kind of gets related to what I said before. I mean, applying models with these kind of multiple factors might be feasible outside the assessment model, but these kind of things might be used to filter the empirical weighted age. But maybe the second point is more pertinent to our group. They had, they fit the data to just the weight at age data, and there was little ability to really distinguish between K and alpha in their particular data set. But I think if we had data with more contrast, and also if we had both length data and weight data at the same time, that might really add a lot more information in terms of which of these things are kind of changing. Another advantage too of if it's feasible to kind of do this kind of work, this random effects works in with the von Berlanti curve, I think we can kind of tie in the stuff Tim Essington was talking about in terms of trying to relate which kind of biological processes are related to changes in size and age. So it's I think it adds a little bit more information if it's feasible than simply just a time series analysis. So that's the first point I said there, and I guess I said the second point too. So anyway, this is just a really quick demonstration of the method. It's like I say, it's pretty similar to what Christine showed, but a difference being that they actually used the von Berlanti curve itself, and they considered variation in both. In two factors, both K and alpha and the Gibbs factor. So, Jim, did you have any comments or corrections on this? Or
No, that's it. Yeah, and clearly, Christine went further in terms of the synchrony, and Alan, of course, too. So it'd be nice, I think in that, if we were going to smooth weighted age data, I've never seen anybody actually use synchrony information to do that, but that'd be something fun.
Were all your data sets, were they from, like what part of the, I guess I didn't read the paper because it's supposed to be, this is mine, but what part of the worlds were they from?
Well, my understanding is that Carolina scraped them out of ICES reports.
Okay.
So I think they're highly skewed towards Europe.
Okay. Yeah, Tom?
And they're probably pretty old at this point.
Yeah, I wonder this exponent 3, I mean, for some, not all fish will probably be growing like in weight like L cubed. Yeah, I mean, surely we can complicate the equation by making that,
yeah.
variable. But I mean, it's for some species or stocks, I think it could be worth just, if there isn't a very good fit, then for the weight data, then maybe have a look at that also.
Right. Yeah, Tom?
So I said, a T0 is really a nuisance parameter in this case, I guess. And T0 is really one of the most poorly estimated parameters, particularly in stocks that are basically captured by trawls and not selected at early ages. So how did you deal with that? Did you put a non-informative prior on it? Or did you try to estimate it?
Jim, did you hear that or?
Yeah, I did.
Okay.
I don't remember.
This might be a similar sort of question, but I know Alan in his thesis, when he was using the von Bernoulli for haddock, he used that extended von Bernoulli where temperature was factored in as a term, and it seemed surprisingly, I don't know, it seemed to me to not be entirely straightforward to do, but could you explicitly incorporate something like temperature into this?
Yeah, I think the next talk is from Tim Miller's model, and that includes a covariate. So.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, I certainly could do that, and Tim has done that.
Yeah.
I should also say in my model, Cecilia's implementation, she included a covariate as well. So we have an example of putting in her case, it was the voltage stream index, which is one of those sort of multivariate measures, but it incorporates temperature for sure. I was going to ask Jim, I know if I were to go back in time and review my analysis, I wouldn't use DIC. I think you missed my simulation study, but I know there's been some literature that it tends to overfit, and I found that in my simulation analysis. Do you have any thoughts on model selection?
Not really. Cecilia in her dissertation spent a lot of time comparing DIC and posterior predictive scores, and Tim and I were both on our committee, and none of them really performed that well. I guess, these days I kind of think any question that you're trying to answer with model selection is probably ill-posed anyway, and personally I'd really love to do more question answering where it's, what proportion of variance is explained by this or that factor, instead of, kind of hoping, model parsimony allows us to resolve hypotheses.
So I have a question on it too. I mean, so this might be a little bit naive, but like in the slide I'm showing here, the bottom one, the minimization of the R squared. I mean, I guess I think of these kind of AIC type criteria as parsimony thing as kind of getting around the issue of, as you add more parameters, of course you're going to add more, explain more variance. So like in the bottom one, I mean, is there potential for just explaining the noise instead of the signal by adding kind of nuisance parameters?
Well, so I can't see that. I can't see the slides online, but my claim is that if you have a hierarchical model or mixed model or whatever you want to call it, it's automatically estimating those shrinkage priors as, from the data. And so, in theory, you should be able to get, asymptotically consistent and pretty good performing estimates of those relative proportions. And, we know in the real world, there's really just tapering effects. There's, a million things that are affecting length of age. And so, I actually do like ecologically the idea of trying to have a model where your goal of inference is estimating those multiple variances, and then doing, like variance partitioning is the term that Gell-Mann sometimes uses as an alternative to hypothesis testing.
Okay. Yeah, Tom?
I guess I have more of a general question. I mean, I have a lot of questions about some of the assumptions, but I won't get into that. But I guess my general question is, if you incorporated, say, temperature, as a covariate in the model, and I presume as a fixed effect, because you want to basically model the the change in weight at age over time as it relates to temperature. And you use, say, variance partitioning to find out and say, okay, well, it seems as though that temperature does seem to have as big or a bigger factor on the variant, the variance explained, the total variance explained. But you've only included temperature, okay? So, it still presents the opportunity to actually detect something or to reject a null hypothesis that's actually true, right? And I just wonder if some discussion needs to be made about, sort of how do we control for the experiment-wise error rate as it relates to all these species we're trying to analyze.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wouldn't phrase it as, an experiment-wide error rate, because like as a Bayesian, I think there's a lot of different. Again, I mean, you can put a model with a lot of different causal factors in it, and then you can try to estimate what proportion of variance is explained by this or that factor. But I do agree that probably there's some work to be done on using simulation testing or something to figure out how wrong we might be about correctly identifying the proportion of variance explained by temperature, or whether the proportion of variance explained by cohort effects versus annual effects is bigger. But I think we could do simulation studies to get at that.
Yeah, and I like the idea of using, posterior predictive distributions, or at least at the margin, to look at, the proportion of the variance explained, because that's easily backed out of the joint posterior distribution. And then I was going to ask about some of the, basically the assumptions on, for instance, the variance-covariance matrix and how you parameterize that, and I don't know what you used for was it conjugate priors, or did you look at sort of alternative priors for some of the parameters?
Yeah, these days I try to use mixed effect stuff to get away from discussions of priors, I forget what I used for the variances, and that's probably the most important one. At the time, I think I was using uniform priors on the standard deviation. And then, I used a parameterization of, instead of k and L infinity, it was length at the lowest age and length at the highest age. And I think I put a uniform prior on those, or maybe they're logs, I forget.
Right. Yeah, let's just double in the details.
Yeah.
Okay. So the next talk is similar, but a little bit different. So Tim Miller, I don't know if you can hear me or if you're online still. I saw you were on earlier.
So do I.
So Tim is a former Seattleite, now works in Woods Hole, and he's actually part of our group. He's somebody that is actually this week is going through the rigors of an assessment review. So that's why he's like working 12-hour days and can't be here. Um, maybe 12 hours might be underestimate. Anyway,
Is he online now?
I saw him. Yeah, I saw him earlier. How do you get back to the?
Click on the no,
Skype's for business.
Okay. And there's the.
the first one. Go back to the
Oh, this one. No, he's off now. Okay.
There's two. If you scroll down,
Oh, okay.
next to Jim Thorson, guest at the top. Yeah, he's there. Yeah, he's there.
Oh, okay.
So
He's muted actually.
he's muted, but
Oh.
he's there.
If you right click on it, unmute.
Tim, can you hear us? Okay.
Not sharing the desktop.
Oh, we're sharing. We're supposed to be sharing the desktop.
If you go back to that window,
Back to the one you're on.
yeah, and the next one, yeah, this one. Share your desktop.
Okay.
I have to say that Loretta O'Brien is a very old, dear friend of mine that I haven't seen in age. So
Uh huh.
if Tim's listening, say hi to Loretta for me.
Okay. So one of the, I won't talk about this a lot, but one of the cool things they did in this one is that they also estimated maturity. And Tara and I have talked about how maturity is related to growth as well. And I first met Tara, in a work group kind of like this, where we were looking at maturity, and Loretta was there in part of that work group. So it's kind of coming full circle in a way. And this one is also kind of related to assessments too. Maybe it kind of shows the crowd I hang out with. But I'll try to gloss over the assessment stuff and kind of get to the von Berlanti model and stuff. So, and these slides are from Tim. He was nice enough to actually put these together for me. So this is all his work. I'm just trying to kind of present it. So here's kind of an outline. Again, a state model, a little bit different than the one Jim and Christine showed. I'll get into that. And some cool kind of stuff going on with aliasing of temperature with growth. I'm not sure why he has temperature as a question mark here. I guess maybe the effective temperature on fish might be a question mark. That's kind of what we're trying to see. Tim was especially interested in looking at uncertainties in terms of the semi-like biomass and also the biological reference points, and also annual variation too in temperature and growth. So this is the Georges Bank area, if you don't know. Size, mean size at age has been declining recently. I mean, there's been kind of this truncation, for cod and the Georges Bank. Somebody talked about retrospective analyses the other day, and how we're using these assessments, and this is really pretty bad. I think Tim mentions in the paper that this assessment got rejected. So they're looking for alternative assessment tools. But this Bowen's row value basically means that, on average, your estimate of biomass might be, 2.5 times, or 250% more than the actual value, which is maybe not a good feature for assessments. So you can kind of see a really downward trend here in semi-stock biomass recruitment. So they're, the motivation here is that they're trying to figure out what's going on, and they're thinking that if they look more at growth, maybe time varying growth might be part of the answer. So this is what it came in earlier when we talked about data, but they've got a really good data set as we mentioned earlier, in the Northeast U.S. We got 2 surveys, both in the spring and the summer. Bottom temperature observations, and the way he calculated the anomalies is, I think, really kind of clever. They have, I think I mentioned this on the first day, but they have a period of a decade of some data called the MARMAP data, which is they have temperature observations kind of across this area every month, so they can use that to kind of tease out an annual signal. And from that, they can kind of tease out the anomalies, for a given station at that time of year, kind of on a monthly basis, and then they can average these anomalies to get an index of temperature, for the area that's kind of weighted by the area of the survey stations, so this model then has, there's kind of both process errors and observation errors in this kind of treatment of temperature. You can kind of think of this, these anomalies, are kind of deviations from this, overall global model for this area. And of course, what a fish might experience, is going to be probably different than what the overall average is too. So that's another form of process error. And then there's observation errors, come from the temperatures data as well. I mean, they're not measured exactly right. So this is in contrast to just having a temperature time series that is input as data that's known with, without any errors. This is actually modeled as a time series process, as a process with both process errors and observation errors as part of the state space modeling system. So, and this is the kind of the model for growth. So in this case, they're modeling both lengths and weights, for individual fish. So the length, term is just the basic von Bernoulli curve here, kind of in log space. And then weights are just kind of the equation I showed you earlier, with the condition factor. There isn't, so the variation in lengths is just related only to kind of process errors in the length and infinity parameter. I mean, I asked him about this, because this is an observation model, wouldn't there be observation errors in length? But if you think about it, the lengths are measured on a survey for any individual fish. They're probably going to measure the lengths pretty exactly. Not so much for weights, though. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but I guess there's maybe more observation errors in weights. But there's a kind of a covariance structure here too, between lengths and weights. So in the model, then we're kind of modeling, we're fitting data to lengths and weights, but there's also temperature that's modeled as a state space manner as well. So this is, there's this kind of C term here, and Tim is looking at variation in the K parameter just like Jim did. He didn't consider other parameters. And when you kind of multiply this out, if all the C's are the same over time, you end up getting the regular basic von Bernoulli curve, but this kind of allows this K parameter to change between years. And this is being modeled in a kind of an autoregressive manner, so there's kind of like a 1-year lag. So these deviations here are autoregressive, and they're modeled as random effects. So the other random effect in the model is the temperature data itself, which is the true temperatures are modeled as random effects as well. So this is the growth rate K for age J in a cohort, and it's kind of a function of the previous year. And this is the temperature in the fall prior to when the cohort was at age J. And this is autoregressive deviation, for these errors. So this is kind of a general, kind of the general equation for modeling variations in K, and then he's looked at, kind of turning on and off different parts, and just, if you fit just a regular, mean value, it's kind of like the basic von Bernoulli curve without any errors in it at all. So this is the, kind of likelihood function. So it's just kind of pointing out, all this stuff here is related to these random effects, in these kind of deviations, these deviations in K, and also the kind of deviations in the true temperature over time. So that's all the stuff up here, and then those are the random effects that get integrated out, and then the fixed parameters, all the things, in the von Bernoulli curve, plus the variance terms too. And there was another, I'm not showing any of the maturity stuff, but this was also estimated at the same time, just kind of focusing on the growth stuff too. So these are some models that he considered. So like I said, if you just, kind of fix K to one value and don't consider any errors in it, you get kind of the basic von Bernoulli curve back, and then another option is to make K a function of temperature, but don't measure any you know, randomness in it, or random errors in this. You know, just, you know, for whatever temperature you get a fixed value of K. You know, so it kind of varies between years, but deterministically as a function of temperature. This I is kind of a you know, indicator function. You know, so it relates to the, you know, ages, and then I think he kind of added effects, you know, different effects for each year up to a certain point where there's kind of diminishing returns. So the difference is in this model there's kind of a single effect for all ages, whereas in this model there's a different intercept for each age up to a certain number of ages. So that's kind of those three models, and these next three actually add in, you know, the autocorrelated errors, which are treated as random effects. So kind of focusing on just three models that show kind of some contrast in the data, just the, you know, just modeling it as a constant, and also, you know, the case where you don't have any variation in this relationship, and then the case where you're looking at the random effects. And this one, you know, he kind of looked at what numbers of ages you have to go out to actually achieve, you know, kind of diminishing returns. So it differs a little bit between, you know, this case where you don't have any errors and this case where you do. So this is kind of an interesting feature of the model. You know, so this is the temperature data. You can kind of see the points are the same in each of these graphs, and this is the different fit, you know, of the model to the temperatures. You know, so G1 fits the temperature data pretty well. G6 does as well too. You know, G3 is, you know, fits, you know, pretty poorly, and there's kind of some aliasing going on here. You know, so if you remember back to G3, there is a temperature effect on K, but there's no errors in it. You know, and what's happening is that the model is fitting temperatures, but it's also fitting, you know, length and weighted age. So, you know, what's going on is aliasing. I mean, the variation, you know, that probably is occurring in temperatures is being attributed to, you know, the weighted age are kind of getting, you know, mixed up. You know, so I mean, there is no variation in temperatures here. So the model is you know, has realized that it can, you know, it can kind of fit the temperature data worse, but it gets a bigger gain in fitting the length and the weight data. You know, and that seems kind of unrealistic. You know, I mean, you wouldn't expect the model to be that off in the temperatures. So, and this is one of the big points in Tim makes in the paper that really relates to our study too. I mean, so like Tara showed, we have these you know, perhaps this signal that we're trying to tease out from all these other factors, and these random effects are basically all these other factors. You know, so unless you have kind of like in a model like this, unless you have a random effect that you're trying to model, you can kind of get confused as to what to attribute the variance to, whether it's temperature or these other things. But in general, I mean, we've heard a lot about random effects today, so I think this is a really useful framework to think about how to tease out signals from noise. So this is some of the, you know, the parameters from G3 and G6. You know, so another kind of interesting thing to note is that, you know, like I say, you know, there's kind of an intercept for each age for a number of different ages, but you notice that the signs are all negative here, and then the sign is changed here in G6 or it's positive. You know, and it seems like this one is maybe a bit more accessible biologically. You'd think, you know, a temperature might have a positive effect on growth rate instead of a negative effect. Let me see here. Anything else to say? Yeah, this one, somebody asked in the previous talk, you know, whether, you know, that that cubic parameter, you know, should be fixed or not, and this one, it's estimated, it comes out to 0.03. Now this is the fits to the length at age, you know, pretty decent fits. So I didn't go into all the associated stuff, but you know, if you're interested, you know, Tim, you know, noted that it does help a little bit with the restrictive pattern, but it's not the only answer. So, you know, he's got a whole full state space model, you know, that includes this as well as other state space things for the assessment, and it does help, but it doesn't give that great a model. But some kind of comments, you know, yeah. So another thing with the G6 model is that it's you know, what he found is that it's the temperature really in the first year of life that is really kind of driving things, you know, and he didn't look at the different parameters that you could add temperature variation into, you know, but just looking at K, that's where the effect was the most strongest, least with the G6 model. So this is the thing about the aliasing, accounting for the unexplained natural annual variation and growth is really important. So you don't have this, it's sort of aliasing and kind of incorrect attribution of the variance for your covariates. You see here, stasis. Yeah. So this is an example of adding like environmental covariate. I mean, there's probably other ones you could add too. You know, but this is, you know, the state space approach is kind of a natural framework for doing this. And then kind of more summary, these are things that I added beyond Tim's talk. And I thought the way he was modeling temperature was really kind of clever. And I think we'll have to kind of think about, like I said a couple times in the meeting, you know, we'll have to think about what temperature data we have, you know, how much process error and observation are in it, and what sort of the common denominator we can apply it across all our different models, across all different parts of, you know, our different parts of the world. You know, in general, like both this talk and the last talk, you know, or I guess this thing, I mean, it's useful to model both length and weight at age if we have that data. I think for a lot of cases, it's, you know, if you're taking an otolith, you're spending a lot of time with that fish, and, you know, most commonly you're probably going to get both length and age, or weight, sorry. You know, and just thinking in terms, again, with the mechanisms, I mean, it's, you know, I think we should apply a variety of modeling choices, you know, but I think that, you know, if we have sort of these models, like the von Berkeley model, that are kind of rooted in, as Tim has showed us, you know, kind of rooted in biology and have pretty strong fundamental, you know, thinking behind it, you know, I think that's a good way to kind of tease out not just how things are varying over time, if they are, but what might be causes of that variation. Anyway, those are just some thoughts on both these studies. Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting that, you know, the principal effect of temperature occurred on the youngest ages of fish.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to think mechanistically about that. And this is cod, right?
Yep.
And the alternative explanation is that there's a relationship between temperature and how cod behave with regard to the survey that's being overlaid on the distribution of those H1s. So wouldn't it be wouldn't you want to need to go back and look at whether or not, again, this has to do with the effect of selectivity and how temperature affects the availability or selectivity of animals in the population to the survey.
Uh-huh.
One thing we do know is there's a number of models that we use in the Northwest where temperature is in fact used as a random effect or some effect on the selectivity in the population model. So do you have any kind of thoughts about, you know, if you see that effect about temperature and something in terms of growth, asking the alternative, which is, you know, maybe we should put in some other factor that looks at selectivity at age 1.
Yeah, so the models I'm thinking of, at least in the Alaska Center, where people have looked at, you know, temperature in surveys, has been more on catchability, so it kind of affects all ages equally. I guess what you're saying, I mean, it would have to have an effect on, you know, on sort of the fast-growing fish being less selected by the survey.
That's right.
Yeah, you know, I guess that could be true.
And temperature could in fact kind of be a stimulus for bigger fish anyways, or fish that are more capable of swimming to be more active. But all I'm saying, I think, is that, you know, in doing these kind of exercises, we need to kind of think about alternative explanations and try to incorporate those in the model. That makes sense with regard to behavior and what we believe temperature is.
Right. Yeah, you could. Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, this is a good framework for doing that kind of thing, because you have, you know, I mean, sort of the defining feature of these status models is that you have, you know, both process errors and observation errors. You know, so you even if the process of temperature on the size of age, you know, is one thing, but then there might be another process of temperature on the ability to catch it.
Yeah. The other question I would ask is, like, you know, I guess cod would be pretty, what I know about northeast cod and the Georges Bank is that the data that's collected at age 1 are pretty robust, right? I mean, you know, it would probably be important to if there's any kind of strong variability that might be due to sampling imprecision to kind of incorporate as a leverage in the model.
Yeah, imagine, you know, I guess I have to go back and read this, but I imagine that, you know, like these lengths and weights that he's fitting to, I guess they're actually the raw data, like individual fish by fish.
Oh, is that right?
So I guess different years would have different sample sizes, you know, so, perhaps.
Individual fish, huh?
Yeah, so like, yeah, so I think like this is like, you know, fish eye, length and weight.
I guess if you looked at the likelihood, you could see what the
Mhm.
spatial and what the spatial and temporal scale is. Obviously, it's annual values because temperature's at an annual resolution, right?
Yep. Yeah, he's got a you know, temperature kind of anomaly for each year.
Anyways, I have to read the paper. Is it published?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it came out this year.
It's on the drive then?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking at it now.
And Tim actually, he put a whole zip file on the drive, so his data's there, his code's there. So, you know, another thing too. I mean, this has come up a few times today. The selectivity thing is maybe useful to think about. So the way Christine, you know, kind of handled this is that the issue, as I understood it, was kind of time variance selectivity. You know, so if you have, you know, there might be some ages that are not selected very well, you know, but it seems like that in itself isn't so much an issue if it stays constant over time. Yeah, I mean, you might.
I was trying to, I was actually just also trying to not over-represent the growth of the younger age classes as well, because I figured if we had ages that were kind of on the limit of being selected, then if you were only like at 20% selectivity, you were only getting the fastest growing age of selectivity classes. So that was it wasn't just time varying selectivity. It was also considering how many fish within an age were selected.
So that kind of relates to your earlier point. You know, I mean, if you're only getting the fastest growing younger fish, you know, then
Well, again, you could treat that as an observation error, you know, part of the state space structure. The only concern I have is that, as you found here, the principal factor driving the relationship or the estimation of it was the temperature on size at age 1. And so if you truncate it before or after age 4, you might get a completely different result.
Yeah, that's true. You might.
Yeah, kind of related to the age, the consideration of ages to include and exclude. I'm wondering, I didn't think of this before when I read Tim's paper, but it occurs to me that what age you detect variation in might depend on which parameter you were looking for variation in. So I think it makes more sense to me that you would, if you were modeling variation in K, you would see it to have the biggest impact at the younger ages. Whereas variation in L infinity you might expect to be more manifest at the older ages.
Right.
And I haven't thought about that before, and I don't know if that would, you know, if you redid this analysis with the same model but with the same structure but on L infinity, maybe you wouldn't conclude that it was all on the youngest fish.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Let's see, I used to be harsh with our salmon growers a couple of decades ago and said that fish doesn't eat temperature.
It doesn't read temperature?
It doesn't eat temperature.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry. But if the temperature goes up, then you think the fish is growing faster just because it's a faster metabolism, or because a temperature increase is associated with more prey around? I will be looking a little in that direction also to see what's really going on.
And I think that gets back to Tim Essington's point about the way that H versus the K parameters vary with temperature.
Right. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so it depends a bit on who you ask, but I suppose theory predicts that the feeding rates scale as fast as the metabolic rates, and that means that growth also goes up.
Yeah, sure.
But people also have suggested that with warming, and even quite a lot of papers suggesting with warming that the maintenance cost will get higher, so that everything goes down. So there are quite clear theoretical predictions that are completely in the opposite side.
Would you clarify that? So if metabolism due to high temperature outstrips the ability to feed, then there's a compromise in the growth.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I'm just clarifying.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of experiments saying that the digestion rate goes up with something between 10 and 15% for each centigrade increase. Even at we in Norway we did some experiments way back because we needed, there wasn't that much of experiments around in the 0 to 5 degree range, so we set up our own, and that was, and the temperature factor came out right, and that's consistent with other experiments also. I don't know how far, this is for Carl, I don't know how far up in temperature you would go before this would change for the cod, but for our temperature range that seemed to work just fine. And yes, they do that just through that 0 degrees also, but it's a bit slower.
Yeah.
So I think one thing in kind of reading all these models, Tim and Jim and Christine's, and I was kind of worried that we'd have to kind of think of like some cool modeling technique to do with this really complex thing, and it seems like people are already doing it. I think it's more of a question of sort of winnowing down and sort of combining what features of which models we like the best, and maybe combining things from models that already exist. Yeah.
So one question is also a bit on what order of magnitude we expect these changes, saying in which type of model we choose to analyze. Because I say if you use metabolic theory, then you would expect that with 10 degrees change, you have a change of maybe 2 times as fast as the growth rates will be. And perhaps so then if temperature goes up with 2 degrees, so maybe then the growth is maybe only 1.1, 1.2 times increasing.
Right.
And that gives you maybe already an idea on what scale you have to find these changes. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So the magnitude of the effects depends, of course, on what type of model is able to see these effects.
Right. Well, yeah, one thing you said yesterday is that I think it was you. Is that just having a higher K, may not necessarily mean increased fitness.
Yeah.
And it seems like this kind of gets to that Tara's point where you might have these, in kind of empirical data, you might have these sort of weak signals as a function of temperature because there's perhaps so many other things that are going on in the environment, biotic and abiotic things that are going on that affect growth. Fish are, they're not just trying to sit in a lab trying to increase their, their body size, but they're trying to avoid being eaten, and they have to fight for themselves, and and they have to mate with their, they have to find mates and reproduce and allocate energy to reproduction and all these kind of things.
Yeah, but if you think of Williams' predictions on body size, then these should be observable. If his predictions are correct, then with most of the models you use, I suppose you will see this effect. Maybe not now, but at least in a few years or decades.
Yeah.
But the question is,
I
was just wondering, the question is to what extent can we pick up these effects with these type of models? And that's of course a bit where we're going back and forth with.
Right. Yeah, Tara?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment on what you just said. We should be able to see them in a few decades, but we should be able to see them in the past.
Yeah, so
as well, given that we've got, and that's the motivation for putting the data
I believe they are there. The question is whether they're, if the change is already big enough to pick it up in this population.
Right, but I mean, the way that I might misunderstand, but the way I was interpreting your question is almost like the difference between a realized niche and a fundamental niche. I mean, maybe the changes are more subtle, kind of in empirical data, because there's all these other factors that kind of beyond just the bioenergetics that we have to consider too. Is that okay?
Yeah, but it's also a bit that if the effects are big, you can just use the von Bertalanffy growth equation and you see the effects. And I'm still not sure on what the effect size is. Is what do we predict now that the effect size would be with these 2 degrees increases over the last years?
I mean, that's a really good point, and there might be, this idea that we may have some stocks that may provide a rich data set for a much more sophisticated approach where we can actually implement some sort of mechanistic underlining relationships. And there's been a couple of marine heat waves, and we have some stocks, at least in our region, that have shown some very similar or body size changes that you would expect. And we may not have to wait 20 years or 30 years to see the effects of what the theory says, because I think some stocks, such as cod in the Gulf of Alaska, may have already experienced them.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about using simulation to figure out what is detectable, how they can affect you, can you detect given the methods we have.
Also, I just want to be very clear that my position is we should not use just one model.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be, there's no reason to limit our analysis for one model, and so I think we can limit the number of models we use, but I definitely think we should not be saying, let's pick the one model that's going to be best. And although I like Tim's probably better than mine, but yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think also the sort of adjoining point to that is you have to be very clear about the question, because the question dictates the model. You don't let the model dictate the question. So I think we can ask a zillion questions, but how do you prioritize them and pick out the one that, the first order question before you move on to second and tertiary order question?
Yeah, I agree entirely. I mean, we have a variety of tools that we can apply, and they're pretty well developed. So there's no reason not to use them.